The second presentation now was going to be with Michael Gaskins, and but actually now, and I was going to be speaking in the parallel session to here, but now it's been swapped over, so I'm going to be speaking here, looking at the potential for dynamic pricing with consumers, how to get customers interested in dynamic pricing. So that's just one change. Okay, so we'll start again. Welcome back from coffee. We looked very much before the break at the different various costs and benefits from different perspectives of smart metering and smart grids. Now, assuming that we do have smart meters in place, assuming that you have those as a mandated rollout, the thing is that what do you do with that? How do you make a platform out of that from which you can get benefits for all the various parties and interests, including the customer, but also, of course, various different players in that market going forwards. And very much in this presentation we have now, what is the regulatory role in that? How do we actually use regulation to make things easier, to make the platform more productive for all those different groups? So I'm really happy to welcome Colin Sausman from Ofgem, the British regulator, and as you know, it's been mandated, smart meters are mandated there. So welcome, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Good morning, everyone. So my name's Colin Sausman. I am responsible in Ofgem for retail market issues broadly defined. So that includes smart metering and other shorter-term and long-term retail issues. And I think, so I came to this conference 2 years ago when it was in Vienna, and we had a similar kind of debate about similar material, but I think the thing that's changed in those 2 years is it's much more now about how we make it happen. Things are already happening on the ground, rather than what should the policy design be. So although the material is quite similar, I think things have moved on a great deal, and hopefully my presentation reflects that. Before we start, though, I should tell you a little bit about Ofgem and who we are. So we're the independent regulator of gas and electricity in GB. We have a duty to protect the interests of current and future customers. And in particular, when it comes to smart metering, we have a number of different roles, which can be captured with the idea that our role is to help nurture smarter energy markets from the platform of smart metering. So we have a role to advise government. So the rollout in GB is a government programme. It's not an initiative of the regulator, but clearly it involves regulatory design, and we have a role to advise. We also will take on some new functions to make sure the rollout happens as intended. We'll have a new license to regulate, and we will regulate certain aspects of supplier behaviour, so that's an important role. And the thing I was going to focus on today was the final part, which is identifying and progressing some of the consequent reforms to how the market operates on the back of smart metering. So I think that the central proposition here is within a smart meter rollout, there's a number of embedded options that allow you to reform other bits of how the market operates. And how you approach valuing those embedded options and making them happen is an important issue for industry and for policymakers also. So just to recap the GB rollout design, I think I can probably go through this material quite quickly because I think it's familiar to lots of people. And it also was covered in the session before coffee by David. So a few key features of the design in GB. It's supplier-led, so energy retailers have the responsibility to procure and install the smart meters, and I understand that I think GB is probably in a minority of one around the world in approaching smart meter rollout in this particular way. An interesting policy choice. I think the rationale for that policy choice was focusing on customers. Energy retailers have a relationship with customers. Customer behaviour change is a big part of delivering the business case. Therefore, it makes sense to have suppliers having the primary interface with the customer when it comes to rolling out smart meters. But an interesting choice, and I think we'll see over time the wisdom of that choice and the effects that it has. It's another point that David touched on is everyone will get an in-home display as part of the mandated rollout. We will also create a new licensed entity, a little bit like a network monopoly in terms of how we regulate it, whose job it will be to essentially manage the data from smart metering systems and make it available to people who have authorized access to it. In order to ensure interoperability, the approach is to have an open, non-proprietary but mandated standard against which people can procure and install meters. And final, very, very important point, which I've touched on a number of times already today, data privacy and data control. The guiding principle here is that consumers control the use of their data. So in terms of a picture, that's what it looks like. The main message from this picture is the suppliers, energy retailers are responsible for the equipment in the house. And the DCC, the data comms company, is responsible for the bit in the middle, which provides a data function and a wide area network and manages the gateway for data to flow from the meter through to people who have a legitimate right to that meter, including retailers, network operators, and importantly, anyone else who the consumer authorizes. So that sort of gatekeeper role is a very important part of the design. In terms of the numbers, costs and benefits, this is the government's analysis. In broad terms, they show a significant cost. So we've already had these numbers presented, slightly different numbers actually. These are for domestic customers only. I think David's included non-domestic as well. But in broad terms, around £11 billion worth of cost in order to deliver 16 billion pounds worth of benefits. And just to reiterate the point that was made earlier on, an important proportion of those benefits relies on customers changing their behaviour in some way. So interestingly, the assumptions that seem to be made in the Netherlands around average energy savings was around about 4%. My understanding is that these numbers assume a more conservative 2% energy saving on aggregate, but clearly these are parameters we will learn more about with experience. So the overall picture is a significantly positive net benefit, and on that basis the government concluded to proceed with the rollout. So then if we say, assume the rollout is happening, how do we make the most of it? How do we make the market work better, and what is the role of regulation? That's essentially the main content of this presentation. And this chart, it's a slightly busy chart, but I'll talk you through it. So it basically says, well, what is it about a smart meter that allows you to do things differently? And in essence, a smart meter allows you to measure energy use in very small time blocks. And that's a very, very simple but important characteristic because of what it allows. So across the top, it allows more information to be presented to the consumer. So there's all sorts of debates to be had around the best way to provide that information, but the raw data is generated by the smart meter itself, and then there's a question of how you translate that into useful information. So how do you convert data into information is an important part of making this work. But I think the evidence also says that information itself, while changing behaviour, will be limited. There's only so much you can do by making people more informed, and that will have different effects in terms of different customer groups. So what else can you do? So if you understand what people are consuming in very small time blocks, then you can contract around that information. And there's two ways you can do it. You can present the customer with a tariff that's based on that information. So the obvious example is a time of use tariff. But you can also contract for changes in consumption against some kind of baseline level, which is essentially demand-side response. So these new contracts of time of use or control of use tariff, if you like, are enabled by smart meters. If you don't have smart meters, the transactions cost of making these kind of contracts work are very large. If you are rolling out smart meters, then you do have the opportunity to develop these new types of contracts. And collectively, the proposition is that will lead to a more active demand side. And I think the reason this is important is because if you look at the supply side of the energy sector, so the figures in Great Britain are in the order of £200 billion worth of investment on the supply side in generation and networks in order to manage a transition to a low-carbon economy. So anything which makes the demand side more active will have significant value if it can defer or avoid some of that 200 billion. 200 billion, very big number. So even relatively small changes in the need to invest on the supply side will have a significant value. So that's the top of the chart. Plus the thing at the bottom is also very important, but maybe less customer-facing. So there are a series of processes that allow the market to operate that are fed by data. And the two main processes are wholesale settlement and registration change of supplier processes. And the argument here is that if you have smart metering data, you can use it to settle the wholesale market more accurately and to make switching much more reliable and quicker. And those enabling changes will affect how the market operates and hopefully improve how the market operates. I think in energy, we seem to take an awful lot for granted, which in other markets wouldn't be acceptable. So we have a third package obligation that says switching should be within 3 weeks, and various member states are doing various things to comply with that particular bit of legislation. But you stand back, what other market do you need to wait 3 weeks to change your supplier in? It's a very, very different proposition in energy, and it must put people off. If people are exploring the best deal for their energy supply, looking at the weekend newspaper, then if you make a decision and you think, well, okay, that's a better deal for me, but I'm going to have to wait 3 weeks before anything happens, it's not particularly engaging. And I think by making changes to make change of supply more active, more instant, you can see different types of engagement. And on wholesale settlement, so lots of people are settled basically on an estimate of what they are consuming and when. And if the data is there to do better than that, so you settle people on what they actually consume in aggregate and over time, you can make bills much more accurate, and people can be made much more aware of the cost implications and the benefits of changing energy use. So two very, very important enabling changes that can be done on the back of smart metering. So Ofgem, we've concluded that there's a programme of work here that we're calling a strategy for smarter markets, which has a design element which involves us as regulators, involves important industry changes also, and has these 4 blocks. So we're saying we do want to reform wholesale settlement. We do want to make change of supply much more reliable, much faster. We do want to think about how you contract for changes in energy consumption, demand-side response at the micro mass scale. We think there's some quite important questions of design about who contracts with who and on what terms, and those are regulatory questions. And we also need to think about how the regulatory framework protects consumers, given that the nature of the offers and the ways in which consumers will engage is likely to change. So I think what we're saying is that there's a regulatory framework that protects consumers currently. That's based on a certain type of offering and a certain type of engagement. If that engagement changes over time, the regulation itself might need to adapt and evolve so that it protects, it allows people to navigate these markets, and it encourages people to engage. So unpacking those, if I can. Okay. So focusing on wholesale settlement. So what's the benefit? So this is a market I'm quite familiar with, which is the New South Wales market. It's a fairly typical movement in wholesale spot prices. So the Australian market is a gross pool. It's an energy-only market. So this is a broad approximation of what the short-run marginal cost of the marginal plant is during a day. This is a fairly average day, and it shows that the spread from low to high within a day is 3 times, so $15 to about $45 in a representative day. And the proposition here is that without smart metering, there is no way to link those movements in costs through into a tariff. So we're not saying that the customers need to be exposed to this particular pattern of prices, although I do know one person I used to work with who actually asked his retailer to be put on a contract which tracked this particular price. And the retailers wouldn't allow him. He said it was too dangerous. And he tried to explain that he actually modeled energy markets for a living, and he was quite happy to take that risk, but he still wasn't allowed to. So there's a very important role for retailers to manage that risk in some way, but it seems like an opportunity lost if you don't allow those cost movements to flow through into tariffs in some way. And the obvious way is through a time of use tariff. So the next issue is change of supplier. So this is a process diagram that describes how change of supplier process works in Britain. And it's courtesy of Alexon, who's the market operator. And the point here is, we don't need to go through the detail, but the point here is that every one of these steps relies on data. And if you don't have real-time data feeding into this process, you can see why it takes a long time. And each one of these steps is a potential problem. You know, issues can arise, errors can happen, and each one of those takes time to resolve. So the proposition here is that if that's the process, then stepping through without smart data, it's hardly surprising it takes a long time and is error prone. But if you have smart metering data, you can do significantly better. Okay, and the next issue is on DSR. So I think the point here is, I mean, it's a very, very complicated question. How do you actually create a market that allows people to transact around DSR? And the reason it's complicated is because where the value resides. You know, so if we say there's a particular user at a particular point in time, at a particular point on the network, and if their consumption changes, then there will be benefits. So that's quite a simple proposition to understand. I think most people would accept that. But the difficulty is the benefits can accrue in a number of different places in the supply chain. So the benefit could accrue in the balancing market, and there's a particular set of institutional arrangements and contractual arrangements that sit around that market. It could accrue in essentially the hedging market and the capacity market. So there are models where you can aggregate demand-side response and use it as a substitute for building generation, you know, particularly peaking generation. And if the value accrues there, then there's a different set of arrangements. And if you look again at networks, so there's an awful lot of discussion around smart grids and the benefits of demand-side response to smart grids. That's a different point in the supply chain where the value might accrue. You know, so the economist in me says, well, what you want to do is you want to use that flexible resource at the point where it adds most to overall system efficiency. So that's the ideal. But then you say, well, so how do you design a market that allows that to happen? And that's quite a complicated thing because current market arrangements tend to work in isolation. And this is something that needs to move across the supply chain. So at one particular point in time, my aggregated demand-side response might be most valuable to the system balancer. On another point in time, it might be most valuable to sell us a supplier as a hedge. So what set of arrangements allows that to happen, and what kind of coordination is needed? And these are very big, difficult questions. And it feels like if we don't grapple with these questions, there's an opportunity missed. So those are the kind of opportunities, and I think they're quite significant, and I think there's significant value attached to all of those things. But there are some important hygiene factors, or I suppose a reality check, and that we need to be aware of if we're going to make the most of these opportunities. And the first one is consumer engagement. I think we're going to talk an awful lot today, and rightly so, about consumer engagement. And I think the argument here is, well, first of all, the diagram is a standard adoption curve that shows as a technology is introduced, you get some early adopters, then you go through the early majority and late majority and get to the laggards, which is a slightly pejorative term, but I think we understand what we mean. And I think the question is, how do you actually get people through that curve more quickly for technology which delivers benefits? And I think the argument here is there is a role for both centralized engagement and decentralized engagement. So there's a role for government and regulators, and there's a role for industry. And but there are some quite important design questions. So what is the role of it? So in GB, the argument, the policy decision has been we will have some kind of central body coordinating engagement and messaging around smart metering as a complement to what the industry does. You know, but detailed questions like, well, what is the scope of that body? What shouldn't it do? How do you fund it? You know, these are all quite important policy questions that we need to grapple with. And how do we learn from the increasing body of evidence around how these things are done in other parts of the world? And then on the decentralized side, clearly there's a big opportunity to engage at the installation visit itself. There's ways to engage through tariff offerings, through services and technology and so on. So how do all those things come together to get people interested, to allay concerns, legitimate concerns that people will have, and to make the most of some of these opportunities? And this is the reality check part. So this is based on some research that Ofgem did a year or so ago around the current state of engagement in the GB retail market. And the picture here is one of disengagement. So there is a relatively active minority who do shop around, do change supplier, are aware of how to get the best deal. But the majority of people, based on our evidence, seem to be disengaged, not particularly interested, or even permanently disengaged, i.e. they haven't even contemplated. They are still with the original supplier, they haven't even contemplated changing supplier. And so if that's the starting position, some of the changes I just talked about are going to be, it's going to be quite a journey to get people from this position to a different type of engagement. It doesn't need to happen for everyone. I mean, this is a fairly typical picture, I think, for lots of markets. So this isn't necessarily a dreadful position, but it is a reality check. And a second hygiene factor or thing to be aware of as we go through is data privacy. I mean, it's massively important that this is done properly and we don't underplay the importance of data privacy. And I think it's for two reasons. One is because, I care what is done with my personal data. I want to have a degree of control. I don't want to be bombarded with emails that have used my personal data. So if you get these rules right, it will build trust. Trust in turn will build acceptance. And acceptance affects costs. So the cost that David was talking about of getting out there and doing the deployment will be greater if people don't want a smart meter or don't understand it. So that's one aspect. And the final aspect is competition, which is these data are valuable. They are commercially valuable. So the privacy rules, in effect, will define property rights and define value. So we need to make sure that how we allocate those property rights or define the privacy rules is amenable to competition and make sure that consumers can realize the benefits of the clever things that are done with their data. So, final point, and it's a question rather than a statement. In other parts of the energy sector, we say that access to essential services such as transmission or distribution on non-discriminatory terms are critical parts of the market design that we can't possibly live without. Question is that also true for data in the smart world? Is access to data as important as access to transmission? And I think in some ways it might well be. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colin. One question? Over here, yeah. Do we have the microphone? Or do you want to shout it and I'll repeat it?
Do you need my name?
No, that's okay.
I was speaking to someone from Siemens earlier about the UK rollout.
Oh, sorry, no, maybe, yeah, we've got it here now, sorry, yeah.
I was speaking to someone earlier at Siemens about the UK rollout, and they were hinting that there's going to be a sort of a rethink of the process and maybe look at DSO model as they do in other countries. You said yourself that the UK is in a minority of one. Can you shed some light on any moves to?
I'm not aware of that discussion. If anything, the legislation to put in place the supplier-led rollout is beginning to be put in place. So I think the first bit of legislation was laid before Parliament last month, and there's a process to put the other legislative instruments in place to underpin the supplier-led rollout over the next few months. So I think if there were going to be that change in approach, it would require, legislating again, and I can't see that happening. You've seen generally some negative on the idea? Sorry, no, I shouldn't have given that impression. Personally, I think it might work out very, very well to go for a supplier-led rollout because of the importance of customer engagement and the argument that suppliers probably do it better than distribution businesses. So I'm not negative about supplier-led rollouts. It's just an observation that it is different.
Just one very quick question, Torbjörn. Yeah.
What was the motivation for establishing the DCC?
Motivation for establishing the DCC?
What was the motivation? I think it was an appreciation. Well, I suppose the alternative is the decentralized model of managing data. And I think it was seen as a better way to deliver the benefits. I think it reflected the importance on getting the non-discriminatory access to data right, and also getting privacy and security right. And there was a view at the time. I mean, I must stress these are government policies. This isn't the position of the regulator. But I understand it was, clearly they're very concerned about privacy and security. And they are also concerned that the access to the data is non-discriminatory. So I think those were the policy drivers. But as I say, it wasn't really the regulator's decision.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Okay, so we'll have lots of questions, I know, also for that.